David, I think viewers are likely to be stunned by today's show because there's a number of things we're going to be discussing that I certainly never knew about. And I always feel like if there's something that I don't know about, there's probably somebody else who also doesn't know about it. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason, and you know a lot, but you're absolutely right. I think this kind of knowledge that we've acquired, I don't say painlessly, but through a sort of historical analysis, and just to anchor the history here, the British Army or military is alleged to have bought smallpox-infected blankets from a hospital and sold them to the Aboriginals, First Nations, to control attacks from the First Nations. So this is a history that may go back to the 18th century. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, you were the first person to tell me about these residential schools in Canada. We did an episode some time ago. I think a lot of people who watch our show, David, they know that I've recently created a David Hawkins reverse CSI YouTube channel, and people can watch simulcasts of our weekly live streams. We're live on there right now, thanks to the people who are watching us there. But I'm also restoring to this channel, David, videos that you and I have been doing for several years. It's taking a lot of time, but they're interspersed here with our weekly live streams. And it might have been 2 years ago that you told me about this occurrence where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police literally forcibly removed children from their parents, indigenous children, Native American children, and put them into these schools to do what exactly, David?
Well, I think the RCMP, typically it's a sort of military organization that does what it's told to do. So basically it was told to rustle up these children, take them to the school. And I believe it was included a responsibility for tracking the prisoners, the unfortunate term, the children that ran away because of the horrendous physical, sexual abuse there, notwithstanding that there will be some children that have good memories of some teachers, priests or nuns at this place, and that's typical. So the RCMP is doing what it's always done, and very fast forward to the present. For example, escorting that woman off the premises at the Winnipeg lab and taking her somewhere, but with no evidence. So the RCMP, of course, is implicitly and inevitably involved in policies laid down by the government. In this case, what we're talking about is the policies laid down by the late Pierre Trudeau, who was Prime Minister of Canada, and continued with his son, Justin Trudeau, to the present day. Over to you.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that's troubling about this, a lot of people are in the comments right now, David, telling us that a guy named Kevin Annett, who I am aware of, he's written about this topic for some time. He's been on it for years. I don't know if you know this, David. I know about Kevin Annett because, like me, he was pursued by Robert David Steele somehow online, taunted or whatever. I want to learn more about Kevin Annett, but I was shocked to learn, David, and we're going to go in depth on this in a little less than an hour when we do our sponsor exclusive show on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi, and Subscribestar and Patreon/crowdsourcethetruth. But it's well known, it's documented that they were doing experiments, medical experiments on these children. What are we going to be focusing on today, David?
Well, this is absolutely right. Now, what I believe has happened or used at these residential schools, they were crucibles or test beds to see what combination of nutrition and vaccines and viruses could be tested out in the school. And here, this is a crime so monstrous, the average person, I think, will be unable to accept that it even exists. I believe there was a strategy here developed by Pierre Trudeau and perhaps perfected by Justin Trudeau of finding out at what levels of nutrition a child, or for that matter, a prisoner in jail, can survive a virus attack and actually become an asymptomatic carrier, so that the virus could be taken by the child, of course, wittingly or unwittingly. And when the child returns to his or her community, he infects and possibly kills the parents and the grandparents. Now, if that's a strategy, of course, it would be totally aligned with the strategy of Fabian socialism, which is eugenics and population control.
Yeah.
And one of the great practitioners of that, of course, is Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Yeah.
And so fast forward with these native schools, well, in particular, let's look at the Kamloops school. The Kamloops school was run up to 1969 by the church, and then a fascinating period of about 10 years followed when the administration of the school was taken over by the federal government of Pierre Trudeau. Right? So that was run by the government, the federal government, and I believe the federal government is directly or indirectly for turning that school into a crime scene, which they're desperately trying to cover up. Right? Now, what kind of crimes would have taken place? Well, some of these children will prove to be, when they do an autopsy, and to the extent I can, I'm insisting as a Canadian citizen that that site or those sites where they find the 215 remains of the children should be treated as a crime scene. And I want to see a yellow tape around it, like
But
now.
pause for a second, David, because you may have just committed a prepositional faux pas. I think it's if they will conduct autopsies, because they certainly don't want to do that. You and I would like to see that, but it doesn't appear that there's no rush to do that there in Canada right now.
No, there's a fantastically expensive effort to divert and decoy, because what they're talking about, including Justin Trudeau, is, well, first of all, he comes out the day after the big announcement that attracted 3.5 million hits last Friday, when the announcement of the 215 children's remains was found. But there was one media source that was absent on that first day. At least I couldn't find it. And it was only on the day after, the Saturday, that the BBC came out with their story, right? Their narrative, if you will, where there was a quote from Justin Trudeau that basically implied this is a hideous example of white colonialism and we should all be apologizing, etc., etc. Well, I'm not apologizing for something that was a criminal act by certain players who haven't been identified. Right?
Well, and certainly you didn't have anything to do with it. It's weird for us to have to apologize for somebody else doing a crime.
But that's the tradition of Fabian socialism. They want to basically denigrate whatever it was that got Canada to the point where millions of people around the world want to immigrate into it, right? And so basically, and divert attention from their failures, their ideological failures that have basically has Pierre Trudeau cozying up to the greatest killer of the last century, Mao Zedong, in 1973. So what I believe they were using these residential schools for, and on your opening collage, you've got a very obscure guy that I'm proud of bringing into the equation. His name is Lionel Pett. He lived to a ripe old age. I think he died at 93 years old in 2003. And he was one of the senior nutritionists. His alumnus was University of Toronto, which was the home of the Connaught Laboratories. And for all I know, he was a thoroughly nice individual, acting in good faith. But he experimented. Well, the problem is we never know in what context these people are working. But he pioneered, I think it was called serial pabulum or something like that, with a fellow Dr. Tisdall, who died much earlier. But this gentleman, Lionel Pett, would have been, after he retired from the federal government, would have been an expert consultant on what levels of nutrition were required in these First Nations or Indian schools, necessary for them to survive a virus infection, right, for which they were vaccinated.
It's pretty close to Nazi doctor experiments, isn't it?
Absolutely. So wittingly or unwittingly, we have Dr. Fauci and Dr. Pett and Dr. Mengele, where it would be prudent, I believe, for the Five Eyes countries to think about what Mengele was accused of doing and what it's possible may prove to have been, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwittingly, the actions of Dr. Fauci and Dr. Pett. Because if those schools, and you actually pointed out to me something I didn't know, there was the equivalent in the United States of these kind of schools.
Well, wait a minute. Let me pause you there for a second, David, because this is massive. And this was just discovered by me. Like I said, I didn't know anything about this until you told me. And I thought it was like something that happened back in the day in Canada. I mean, certainly we can look at 1960 in the United States, and there were a lot of things going on that were reprehensible. And we can look at that as history. But what I was shocked to learn is that not only do these schools exist in the United States, there's one right here in New York, David, the Thomas Indian School. And there's something I want to share with you that I have not yet had a chance to show you, which is that Thomas Indian School. It's in Irving, New York. And as we travel there virtually, this thing appears to be still running. And there's something else about it that I'd like you to see. This is something we have observed around the world in multiple locations, David, but when Google doesn't want you to know about something, they don't bother with 3D models of it, which they could easily create from satellite images with photogrammetry. And even more so, you can't get near this thing. You can't drop this little Google man anywhere in here to see Google photos down any of these streets that would allow us to observe what's going on at this school. What do you think about that, David?
Well, immediately, there's the possibility of unmarked graves. Right? Now, if you can just go back to the Wikipedia entry, because there's two words there that are absolutely critical for our listeners to understand what's going on with these residential schools. So just over to the left, right? Okay, zoom in, and you have the word forced assimilation. That is to say, there was a federal strategy, right, under the federal policy of forced assimilation, meaning they had exactly the same policy in the United States as in Canada to force the assimilation of these children that were abducted from their homes and families, and they arrive at the school. And now, certainly at Kamloops, they said it was poorly ventilated, it was unhealthy, etc. It was a petri dish for disease. So when and if, let's say, a proper crime scene investigation is done on some of the remains that may be buried, that certainly are buried in the Kamloops school and may be buried at this school that you've just identified. Look at it, the term is an asylum. There will be a spectrum, I can guarantee it, Jason, of reasons for death, ranging from malnutrition or starvation to sexual abuse through to death from disease. And it's only by doing autopsies on each of those remains that's more respectful treatment of those remains than it is to parcel them up, try and do some DNA tests, and return a package to the family if they can find them, so that they can be buried according to their traditions. Without the crime scene investigation, which is what, well, I am on your show are all about, and that's hence the phrase reverse crime scene investigation, we will not know what caused the death. And if it was a strategy laid down by, let's say, Fabian socialists and the Clintons of creating a community where there's just enough nutrition for children or young adults to survive a virus and become, when they return to their communities, asymptomatic carriers, that may prove to be a far better explanation of the expansion or the spread of the COVID-19 than what's coming out of what's between Dr. Fauci's ears, which in my opinion is not a great deal. Over to you.
Well, I agree with that. There's a few more things that I would like to go into with you, David, relative to these Indian schools, because I'm just looking at the chat here, and there are people mostly in the United States West who are familiar with these schools, and Blue Skies even tells us he or she has Navajo friends who went there. This is St. Michael's Indian School. I think this is in Arizona. I find it interesting again, David, that we have no 3D photography of this. A lot of dirt roads. What do you think of that?
Well, so now back to the idea, and let me just flip back to World War II, when the British wanted to persuade the Germans that the attack on the D-Day landing attack would take place in the Pas-de-Calais area. They built directly opposite the other side of the channel a whole mustering station for inflatable tanks.
My favorite.
Right? You want one, I think.
I do.
Maybe
I need a bigger apartment to get one of those.
But the kind of surveys that would have been done by German reconnaissance aircraft were such that they would not, that was the intent, not be able to distinguish between an inflatable tank and a real tank. Now, fast forward to the present, the biggest purveyor of satellite images of grave sites, unmarked grave sites, allegedly associated with COVID-19, is an outfit called Maxar, right? So Maxar, remember, absorbed McDonnell Detweiler, and McDonnell Detweiler was at one time the largest satellite signal data processor in the world, and it would provide 24/7 surveillance of all of these grave sites, potentially for the purpose of whatever, but possibly to prevent anyone infiltrating these schools, etc., digging up the remains and discovering that some of these children were murdered through sexual abuse. Right?
Well, I have another question for you, David, that pertains to Maxar. Because unlike Google Maps, which is like all about street view stuff, the Google Earth is made from satellite-based images. That's how they're able to do this 3D photogrammetry. They have so many different angles on this thing that they can assemble a 3D image. So whoever it is that, captured and collected all this satellite imagery, they could have a 3D image of this St. Michael's School, but they don't want us to access that.
Yes, and those images of 3D, well, 12D in my object-oriented fractal paintbrush model, I believe are being fed by Maxar into BBC studios. So in BBC studios, and there's 29 around the world, right? 7 in the United Kingdom and 4 in China and 1 in New York, right? I believe now through fiber optic links, they have an almost unhackable network where the BBC studios can develop the parallel narratives, one of which is what they want us to believe, one of which is what their operatives need to control the spread or the perceptions about COVID-19 in the global collective mind, right? Which is essentially one step, and a very vital step, to global population control, which they've nearly achieved. Over to you.
They have nearly achieved it. There's a couple of, I'm sorry to be fixated on this, David, but not really sorry. I want to try to gather as much information from this. I mean, this is decimated photo information. We don't have 3D. We can't put the little character down to get close-up photos, so we're really looking at this from a distance. I've immediately spotted some kind of contradictory things about this. So first of all, the fact that it's out here in the middle of essentially the desert, and it's got a lot of what look like dirt roads. This parking lot looks like not the most paved thing I've ever seen. That does not, scream modern construction to me. It seems like sort of an old building, compound sort of thing. But when I come over here and I see this facility with all the solar panels on it, and it's right next to this, what is this, tank? Or, I don't know what that is. If we could see it in 3D, maybe it's just a water tower, but it maybe, I don't know, what is going on here where we've got this modern looking building with solar power, this thing that seems shrouded by trees. We really don't know because we're not allowed to look at detailed satellite imagery of this.
Well, absolutely. And if you Google Maxar and the BBC and mass grave sites in Iran, you'll see what, if you flip back 50 or 60 or 70 years or whatever, what
Libya,
things might have. Sorry?
Was it Iran or Libya?
I think it was Iran, but maybe it was Libya. But anyway, it's a satellite view of burial pits associated or allegedly associated with the spread of COVID-19, which is recorded on a daily basis by the BBC to a degree of precision that I think is a fatal flaw in their conspiracy, because we're going to find out that many of these images have been subjected to artificial intelligence manipulation to give people the impression of the spread of COVID and get the public to make panic decisions into the purchase of vaccines, right? For example, those that are offered by Pfizer, right?
Ooh, so this is it. Look, Maxar.
Yeah, right. Maxar, and down the bottom, it used to have on some of those images, it's got BBC. So for me, these images are being commissioned from Maxar by the BBC, injected in, remember, to create a resilience image for the government of the United Kingdom, where they're basically saying that we're borrowing the BBC's network, which I believe is now the best protected from a security point of view network in the world, because they're using fiber optics and not satellite communications or mobile communications. Now, remember, a few days ago, there was a massive arrest announcement of about 1,000 senior criminals or elite criminals around the world who had been trapped by the FBI into using this Anom mobile technology that had been encrypted. And that came about as a result of the vacuum created by the shutdown, if you will, of Phantom Secure and Sky Global, both of which appear to have their headquarters in Richmond, British Columbia, which, thanks to Justin Trudeau and Pierre Trudeau, I believe, with Vancouver, has created a haven for criminal organizations around the world, where the competition is coming from other criminal organizations in countries like Australia and the United States. So what they've done, and I challenge our listeners to find out, is how many senior Canadian criminals have been arrested as a result of the bust of Anom. And it looks like to me, I'm just making an inference on the fly here, it looks very much to me like the FBI, the Americans and the Australian police suspect that there is massive leakage of intelligence, criminal intelligence, out of BC in particular, and Canada in general, and the United Kingdom.
Had you ever heard of this Anom thing before this? I never heard of that.
No.
Yeah.
But apparently there was a vacuum created by the shutdown or roll-up of Phantom Secure and Sky Global. But the senior criminals, of course, if you got a shipment of cocaine coming into Vancouver Harbor and you suddenly lose your communications with that ship, you got maybe $5 million worth of cocaine coming into Vancouver Harbor, and you got to get it off the boat onto a lighter and distributed, through the various channels. You got an emergency. So they were desperate to get an alternative communication system. So the FBI pops in with its own product. I don't know who made it for the FBI, but the fact remains is, if we go back to the FBI, it was the FBI together with the RCMP that raided Starnet.
Right. Well, these were, I think, Google Android phones that there was an operating system or something created to make it, an encoded, encrypted thing.
Right. So the physical construction of the device, would have been handed
from Google,
off-the-shelf stuff. Someone put a modification system together, and that might have been a laboratory controlled by the FBI or theoretically controlled by the FBI. But what I would like to suggest to organized criminals who may be festering in jail, waiting, for a serious investigation into what they did, maybe their systems had been hacked by a more powerful system that was invisible to both the FBI, the RCMP, and I'm talking now about the system that appeared to have been built in BC and Richmond, called Childbase, right? And Childbase, remember, got that prize from Cyberpol, right? That included Pulscybe, which included a very interesting guy, if I get his name right, by the name of Hong En Ko, right? And Hong En Ko is a senior technology president or vice president with Huawei.
Yep.
Hong En Ko. Yeah, just hold it there. Now, this is a very interesting guy, right? Because he was a member of the board of Polcybe that gave a cyber award to the partners that produced this child-based package.
Buck
Now,
Revell.
he's a thought leader. Sorry?
Well, it was Oliver Buck Revell, wasn't it?
Yes,
So
Oliver
he's
Buck
FBI.
Revell. Yes, ex-FBI, right? Who pioneered the development of artificial intelligence face recognition technology in Vancouver, starting, I think, around the 1996 period. And I believe the technology that he provided was used to track, for example, the people who abducted the women who were ultimately murdered or disappeared along the Highway of Tears, or basically granulated out at the pig farm with a 600-pound bore into something that would be extremely difficult to prove how they died. And we're talking big numbers. So now this guy, Oliver Buck Revell, I allege in conjunction with Hong En Ko of Huawei, right, and the National Crime Squad in the United Kingdom, and Serco, right, that has got a major contact tracing for the public health authorities in the United Kingdom to track down people who might have been infected by COVID-19 or might have translated that infection to someone else. So what you've got is an extraordinary organization that is able to use face recognition to track people suspected of carrying COVID-19 or failing to obey the spacing laws, the 6-foot spacing laws, or not wearing a mask or refusing to take a vaccine. So you now have a surveillance state that can actually track you right through every encounter you might have with a child. It can actually frame you with an encounter with a child in a room where the room that you thought you'd rented out or occupied in New York, for example, the following day, that same room might have been used by an actor dressed in your clothes, abusing a child to frame you and unless you're extremely technically sophisticated, which I'm not. So it makes it look like that you have abused a child, which is one of the predicate offenses under RICO. Over to you.
Well, let me step that back for a second, because without focusing on child abuse for a moment, I think this entrapment is something that the FBI does all the time. Set people up and then catch them and use them to, do something that the FBI is trying to do. I'd like to drop a bombshell, David, if I may.
Please.
So, in the case of Steele v. Goodman, it came up that there was this big issue of my use of an email address on Proton Mail. Have you heard about Proton Mail, David? Do you know what that is?
A little bit.
It's an encrypted email service that's based, I think, in the Czech Republic or somewhere outside of the United States. So U.S. courts cannot subpoena this service, and it's encrypted. So the idea is this is some secure way of communicating or something like that. But if you lose the password or forget the password, unlike a normal email address where you just say, oh, well, email to my other account a password reset link and I'll change the password and get in there and get all my messages. This Proton Mail thing, when you lose the password, if you go back in there, it says, okay, to secure your encrypted emails, we're going to delete them all and then give you a new password. So you can still have this email address, but you can't access any of the old communications. And they were insistent in Steele v. Goodman, the lawsuit against me by Robert David Steele, who claims to be ex-CIA. They were insistent in discovery that there must be messages that I had sent and received in this Proton Mail account, and they wanted me to produce them. But I couldn't because I had forgotten the password and I had stopped using the thing a long time ago. And I think I haven't spoken to you very much about this guy. But when I was doing videos with George Webb, he introduced me to an individual named Oki Marshall Richards, who George's brother later revealed was an FBI informant. And I didn't even know his name was Okie Marshall Richards. I thought his name was Richard Stone. And I believe, David, they were trying to set me up for something, and that this Proton email account had something to do with it, because they were desperate to get me to produce this stuff in federal court. Now, when you think about RICO charges, you've brought up RICO many, many times. This is an article from 1997 about this guy, Okie Marshall Richards. This is from the AP, and it was also reported in the Washington Post. But what basically happened was this guy, Okie Marshall Richards, set up an individual named Ray Looker, and Looker went to jail for 18 or 19 years, David. So, in other words, if I was on an email chain with a bunch of people who had committed a crime through RICO, I could be implicated in that crime. And even if I was eventually able to prove that I was innocent, I would be put in jail. I would be put through a criminal trial. And I believe that this is what they were trying to do. David, this Proton Mail issue has resurfaced in Emmys versus MSD. The Television Academy is suing me. They're so interested in this Proton Mail account. I think that they're, and it's just days ago that it came out that the FBI had this elaborate sting, also with encrypted communication technology. What do you think about all this, David?
Well, this comes back to they can attack you from multiple directions with multiple proxies and hope that you get diverted, decoyed, and distracted and spend a great deal of time and money on going after a red herring, essentially. So if we fail collectively to go up the food chain and find out what organization can hire a hit team or a team that can actually set you up as though you were doing something that you shouldn't have been doing in a RICO situation, we have to go up the food chain. Or let me put it bluntly, I believe you're going to lose the republic in the United States, and you're well on the way to losing it. So going up the food chain to the BBC, now we've got this network, 29 BBC studios around the world with fiber optic links. Now, I went on an invitation many years ago to tour a Canadian warship with a group of people, and there's a door which says control center, do not enter, etc. And that's where the brains of the warship are. And the theory is you can only get in and out with very careful controls. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if that kind of technology, secure military technology, was installed with the BBC studios around the world, and the BBC studios were commissioning companies like Maximus or Maxar to feed them with the kind of data that would allow BBC studios to generate the daily body counts that might be then sent to Dr. Fauci. That is to say, Dr. Fauci, I've been looking at his record. He's obviously a very capable researcher, right? He's written a number of papers and edited and so on as a doctor, right? But I believe this man is totally naive or unwilling to accept that the data that he's being fed as it relates to body counts or infections could be created by rogue artificial intelligence. Yeah, you were just about to bring in that image there. And just to get people up to speed with the flavor of what's going on here, you can see the date of that, the BBC, just stay with that, the BBC. This is source Johns Hopkins University, National Public Health Agencies, 11th of June, i.e. today. And here's something that I hope one day John Cullen can help us on, but I know instinctively, no, if you can just stay, sorry, just stay with that image. And I want to look at the numbers there. So on the 11th of June, whether you call it a consortium or not, or a partnership, BBC News and Johns Hopkins University are presenting this data, and that is going out with the BBC's, to an audience of 500 million people around the world in 50 languages, where they say the latest daily figure is 450,196 new cases. There's something wrong there. There's a concept in science or data. One is accuracy and the other one is precision. That is an inappropriate level of precision for data acquisition that theoretically would require someone in a hospital to call up the BBC and say, hey, we just got 3 dead. And we think or believe this is COVID related. Whether it is or it isn't, the fact is that data is coming into the BBC. It's being regurgitated to an unwitting audience and an uninformed audience. And that's the driver of this panic buying of vaccines. And I'm not saying the vaccines are good or bad. All I'm saying is this is an algorithmically driven process to generate a demand for a vaccine that is then generating huge profits for the shareholders in, for example, Pfizer, where we're back to Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock, which also controls Boeing and Costco and Maximus and Maxar. So that's, I told you a little this morning that I coined this phrase, but it's probably not appropriate. The trifunda. The trifunda actually controls the global financial community. So there you have data that is changing by the second that I believe is based from or generated by algorithms, artificial intelligence algorithms of the type I've been warning against for 40 years. Now look at this amazing chart. You know, you see, it starts with everything is happening in Wuhan City, and it ends up to the present time with the United States as the principal offender, together with India and Brazil. Let me go back to the residential schools. I believe over the last 50 years, Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau have developed a dilemma game, or are implementing a dilemma game, where effectively incarcerated children in residential schools or prisoners in jails, privately run jails, or children in refugee camps or holding camps or transit camps are being infected with a virus, right? And given nutrition that allows them to survive the virus, but can then be turned around, educated, angry against the Five Eyes countries, and sent back to or sent into Wuhan City, for example, to drive a virus outbreak that kills lots of people and basically sends a message to the communist Chinese, no matter how powerful they think they are, they can be taken out. Next could be Shanghai or Beijing or New York or London. So they're actually controlling the population through a combination of nutrition, viruses, and vaccines, and fear spread through the greatest propagandist in the world, which is the BBC and its 29 studios around the world. Over to you.
There's one more thing I wanted to share with you about this FBI encrypted stuff, David. Do you know who else is ex-FBI and was repeatedly trying to get me to communicate with her through Signal and Telegram and other encrypted apps?
Just tell me.
She was also introduced to me by George Webb's Robin Gritz. I don't trust anybody in the FBI.
No. And I think that's legitimate, because no matter what officer wants to do, right, first of all, they've got a military chain of command, so they're told what to do. And secondly, they have a communication system that I believe has been hacked by a much more powerful organization, which is the organization associated with child base and pedophile entrapment and pedophile extortion. And child base effectively started in Richmond, British Columbia. Over to you.
Right. And Oliver Buck Revell, he's amazingly active for a guy who, he's in his 80s. And actually, that reminds me, when you brought him up initially, I was searching for him and I was a little bit kind of bored of some of the articles that we always bring up about him. So I found this new one. This is from the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza, which is the museum all about Lee Harvey Oswald and the assassination, or their story of the assassination of JFK. And they've got Oliver Buck Revell listed here. It says that he was a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, another military organization that I absolutely do not trust. Revell joined the FBI in 1964, partly, David, because of his interest in the Kennedy assassination. And during his long career with the Bureau from 1964 to 1994, he's one of these federal bureaucrats who comes and, presidents come and go, and this guy's still there. Buck Revell achieved the rank of Executive Assistant Director of Investigations, and he was a 6th level member of this SES, something that you used to tell me about, or I forget exactly who, maybe Phil, or I don't know much about that SES, but I remember it came up quite a bit. Revell worked with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was very involved in covering up a lot of facts about the assassinations. And he was the special agent in charge of the Dallas division. He supervised the release of the Dallas FBI office's assassination-related files in the early 1990s, which would have given him a great opportunity to pick through them and just sort of include the things that he wanted to include and remove any. He could spoliate all the evidence, right?
Well, absolutely. And so then we have this, how you and I have gone backwards and forwards in terms of artificial intelligence about tracking characters to understand narratives. And what I think is now infinitely important is tracking the narratives to understand characters. So first and foremost, I think what we can do is track the evolution of the virus over the last 50 years, associated with, for example, when the federal government took over the residential school, the Kamloops residential school, where I think there'd been some experiments involving nutrition, vaccines, and viruses to see what would support the health of the children. But if you run into those next 8 years or 9 years, from 1969 to 1978, I believe Lionel Pett was now a consultant to the federal government of Pierre Trudeau. And Pierre Trudeau was working with the Chinese communists. You remember, Pierre Trudeau visited Mao Zedong in 1973 on the development of a system where you could take a closed community and through some combination of nutrition, vaccines, and viruses, you could create an asymptomatic carrier community that could then be deployed from Canada, for example, to Wuhan City, because these are people who are part of a Chinese or Hong Kong diaspora that have fled the communists in Hong Kong, for example, come to Canada in good faith, but then be subjected to a dilemma game engineered or constructed by Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, and now Justin Trudeau, where they're told, all right, you can be given citizenship and a job and decent food while your children and family adjust to the new kind of life, but it comes at a price. You become a double agent for the Trudeaus. Just like in the Second World War, every German spy that was sent by the Germans into the United Kingdom, by the end of the war, had been turned and was feeding back disinformation. So what I'm suggesting is, whilst the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the Second Bureau, which specializes in clandestine intelligence, thinks that they control their agents in Canada, maybe they're actually totally wrong, and maybe their agents in Canada are double agents for the trifunders, that is to say, the $20 trillion funds that control Maximus and Maxar and Boeing and Pfizer and Costco, right? That's where the power is. And if I could just quote, because I hope I'm not losing people, Sir Walter Raleigh, he was an adventurer and a privateer, I think, at the end, in the beginning of the 17th century. He said, whoever controls the oceans controls the trade across the oceans. Whoever controls the trade across the oceans controls the riches of the world. Whoever controls the riches of the world controls the world itself. If you substitute the internet for the ocean, the British Empire still controls the world, right? Even though it's actually more dangerous now because it's gone behind the curtain, right? Whilst we talk about Anom and the raids by the FBI, where they joined the group that took down Starnet, what we're not realizing is the quality of secure communications put together by the BBC, which was founded in the 18th of October 1922, the same day as a digital virus was released at the Event 201 Pierre Hotel in New York, and a physical virus was released at the Wuhan City Military Games. And there are no
Now, David,
coincidences.
I agree with that. Let me just bring you back for 1 minute to the collage, because we've got some people in the comments who have some questions still. And I kind of want to bring this together for everybody thematically. Why do we have all these people listed here? We've got Dr. Pett. Interesting name, considering Pierre Elliott Trudeau is often referred to as Pett. But we've got Mao and Pett with Dr. Pett. And then we've got Hillary and Bill with Dr. Fauci. Why did we put all this together in front of this residential school here, David?
Because the supply chain of contaminated blood that has driven the development of what I call the Trudeau Kamloops virus was put together in a conspiracy, witting or unwitting, willing or unwilling, between Bill Clinton, who was the Attorney General in Arkansas and then became governor. But Bill Clinton, after being kicked out of Oxford, just think about this, he was kicked out of Oxford accused of rape and drug dealing. He swans off to Moscow in 1969, 17 years after the visit by Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He comes to the United States and takes his degree in Yale, and then he goes down and he becomes a professor of law, I think it's constitutional law, at the University of Arkansas. And that would be about the 1973-74 period. But in the 1960s, physicians at the Arkansas University hospitals began collecting blood from prisoners in the Arkansas correction system. And they were paid apparently $7 a pint, paid in scrip, meaning they could buy cigarettes, I guess, at the concession in the prison, some of which were being privatized. That blood that was extracted from the prisoners was rich in all kinds of viruses and so on because of the sexual practices of the prisoners. But where did it go? It went through a broker in Montreal, sort of the home base of Pierre Trudeau, and then over to Connaught Laboratories to be fractionated and turned into a plasma that was rich in Hep C and HIV. So Canada shipped pathogens around the world that probably injured millions and killed thousands under the jurisdiction or surveillance or authority or administration of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So I believe Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Bill Clinton founded the supply chain for toxic blood that could ultimately be used, subject to refinements and concentrations and fractionations or gain of function research, into pathogens that could be used to target certain populations ethnically or age-wise or whatever, and establish the controls that are the great goals of Fabian socialism, right? Population
Now,
control.
wait a minute, David, because there's one other thing that I've cooked into this image, and we are running out of time here. We're just a few minutes away from our sponsor exclusive segment where I want to take you down this road that I'm about to reveal, but people are going to be able to watch that on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi, or subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. But I like to communicate through images and put things into these collages because I think that they can become sort of a puzzle, sort of a story. But I've put in the background here, David, a site that you will remember. This is the mural painted on 425 Carroll Street, which was the offices of StarNet Communications. And when you and I went there, a local told us, and David, the speed at which he revealed this, he answered as if it was something that was so commonly known that there was no doubt in his mind, at least, that this mural represents a warning. And this is a photograph taken outside St. Michael's Residential School, which is here in the United States in Arizona. And I mean, is it just me, or is this a similar looking kind of thing?
No, and it's totally. And so It is a warning, I believe. And so now if you flip to the carving or statues outside British Broadcasting House, and the very chilling phrase of the first word of the Benedictine Creed, and there you have these winged figures serenading, I'm not quite sure if that's the appropriate word, a sexualized statue of a boy Christ up on the
Computer's
cross.
not cooperating.
All right, where the book that is held to the private parts of the sexualized Christ has got the first word, there it is, of the Benedictine Creed, which a wonderful listener, a hat tip to that, told us meant listen and obey. So what I'm saying is that the whole method, reason for existence, the raison d'etre for the BBC that was founded on the 18th of October, 1922, is to generate a mixture of propaganda, news and events, news and entertainment related to, at the moment, the spread of COVID-19, which is telling people, listen and obey. Do not question, put on your mask, stand 6 feet apart, do not assemble in groups that might be interpreted as a threat to the communist state, right? So the legacy or the DNA of symbols is perhaps more important, Jason, than our words. And what,
Yes.
from a discovery point of view on the fly, I think what you discovered at those sites where there were residential schools is an indication that they're hiding the unmarked graves, but not proof, but certainly up at Kamloops. And those unmarked graves should be subjected to a crime scene investigation to do exactly what I've been proposing now for decades, well, a long, long time, reverse crime scene investigation to find out what the victims died from, right? And then put it together in a narrative and compare that with the narrative offered to us almost monopolistically by the BBC when any major event happens. If you see the BBC releasing the story before legitimately they could have possibly found out the guilt or innocence of the party, you know you're on a parallel narrative technique pioneered and perfected by the BBC and now injected through BBC studios around the world. And basically the population is being controlled by these people. Over to you.
Yeah, David. And we're going to be starting our sponsor exclusive show in just a moment, where I'm going to go into a lot more of these symbols that I've found and a lot more things that are kind of disturbing. So I hope people will join us. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on in our collage here before we go is that a lot of people are still having a difficult time believing that Dr. Fauci, trusted, whatever the hell he is, could possibly do something deliberate that would harm the public. But I think that another one of my goals in juxtaposing him with this guy, Dr. Pett, is that I think probably a lot of Canadians would have felt that way about whatever the government was doing with these indigenous schools at the time. So we're going to look at a few more of those. We're going to look at some more of these symbols. I want to talk to you also, David, about the symbology surrounding the ancient Egyptian deity or whatever he is, Horus, and how this imagery seems to correlate to certain things in Native American imagery. There's a lot going on here, and it goes way below the surface. So I want to thank people for joining us right now and encourage them to join us in just about 5 minutes when we continue on Patreon and Subscribestar. Anything else you wanted to say really quickly, David, before we...
Yeah. Yes, I just want to emphasize that I believe that the BBC has commissioned Maximus and child-based partners to deliver body counts to people like Fauci, which would make him merely perhaps careless in checking the source of the data. And I believe that the graves that bury unmarked sites that are necessary to be subjected to a crime scene investigation are being surveilled 24/7 by the company Maxar. And the problem for the United States, perhaps the world in general, is the shareholders of Maxar and Maximus are one and the same, or three and the same. That is to say, State Street and Vanguard and BlackRock. Effectively, these companies become branch offices of a group of funds that control $20 trillion of assets online. And basically, I would say they control the world itself. Over to you.
Yeah. So, David, that's all for our lead in here, and we are just about to head over to Patreon and Subscribestar. So I want to thank everybody for watching. I want to thank the generous sponsors. We're just under an onslaught here from social engineers. They do not give up. So we'll see everybody